Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. Today, we have with us Gurmehar Kaur, the ferocious author of Small Acts of Freedom and The Young and the Restless. I'm sure a lot of you have read her books, but join me for this really interesting conversation that I had with her with absolutely great insights into the workings of this really amazing young author. So, without any further ado, here we go. Hi, Gurmehar, and welcome everyone to another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. We have with us Gurmehar Kaur. I'm sure all of you know her. She has written this really heart touching book, if I may put it that way, titled Small Acts of Freedom. And yeah, so Gurmehar, welcome to the podcast.
No, Siddharth, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the brilliant introduction. I'm very excited for this conversation.
Right. Okay, so Gurmehar, I have a question which I typically ask literally to every author who I interview. Tell us something about you which we won't find on the internet or like on in the bio of your books.
Oh my God, that I think a lot. I feel like I have a whole personality that you won't find on the internet.
Really?
Um, oh, 100%, 100%. I think that's what all my friends tell me because I think a lot of
Okay.
my work is either very sad or very political.
Right.
But I don't think I'm a sad person that way, or that political or angry. So I guess
Okay.
maybe that. But yeah, I have a completely different personality that you do not find on the internet, and it's a little bit sad. But yeah.
Okay. Okay. So maybe one thing about this different personality that we don't find on the internet.
um. Well, okay. I think one thing that people don't know about
Mhm.
me is that uh I think I'm a very funny person, and I have some of the funniest, like the most ridiculous dating stories.
Huh. That does sound like most 20-year-olds today. So I mean, it's great to know like even authors and like politically inclined authors who's, as in your words, have a sad online presence or are depicted sad, have
Yeah,
interesting dating stories. But
yeah.
okay,
I
so
have some of the most ridiculous ones. Yeah. I mean, I won't tell you about it, but yeah,
no, don't worry. I'm not going to probe you about your dating stories, but
yeah,
let me just put it across as like a fellow 25-year-old man. I think literally everyone in their 20s just have like this crazy dating experience now, or like, at least a lot of them. And
yeah.
yep, and it just feels great, you know. So that just pivots me to the next question that I wanted to ask you was so as you mentioned, right, you have this entire political persona, right? That you are very politically opinionated, and you know you were always talking about serious things, and it's a great thing that you do. I mean, I follow you on
Yeah.
your, social media, and I constantly see you posting about issues that need to be spoken about or voicing your opinion about things that matter. And I mean, just knowing this one tiny bit, right? Like even you have
Yeah.
ridiculous dating stories. Is it just kind of, if I may put it this way, kind of
Mhm.
humanizes the entire process, because when you read about an author or like, you know, and in today's world, when you just like follow them on the
Yeah.
internet and follow their lives, you just, they just appear to be like this out of the world people who have like this entirely different persona, and like,
Yeah.
I don't know, outside of human experiences, despite them writing a lot about it. I mean, like your book
Yeah.
like speaks a lot about those emotions, which brings me to that. I read a lot of your book. I was just about
Mhm.
to finish it yesterday, but I couldn't. But something that really appealed to me was the way you wrote that book. I mean, it was
Mm.
unlike a lot of other literature which we read, to the extent
Yeah.
that it has simple but like hard hitting sentences and
Yeah.
like in your formation structure. So if like, I know you might have been asked this
Mhm.
question multiple times, but did you ever feel pressured to kind of, you know, conform with certain kinds of literary styles, or like writing maybe a book which
Um,
was, and I mean, I'm not
Not really. No,
hmm,
I don't think there was ever a moment where I wanted to conform to anybody's literary style. I think one thing that I was
hmm,
very certain was that I wanted to keep the voice, so the voice of the protagonist as a 3-year-old child, and then slowly
right,
growing up.
right,
and as the child grows up to complicate the sentences
Right.
with age. But
Mm-hmm.
even then, even then, my I mean, you haven't reached that part yet. But the but 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 you only hear a 16-year-old Gurmehar's voice, which is still not very formed, which is still not very complex. It's still,
Right.
it's still very raw. And I think
Right.
that's something that I wanted to do just because I think it's very powerful to read about stories from a child's perspective. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing to say this happened to a child, but I think it's
Right.
completely another when you hear it and see it from their point of view. And I wasn't and I think I wasn't very. I think one I knew I couldn't copy anybody else's style,
Right.
because you can do that for like a paper or an essay
Right.
or a 2,000 word project or a
Right.
workshop, right?
Right.
But you can't sustain that for a full book. It's
Right.
just not sustainable. Um,
Right.
and you have to trust your own voice. I think I was very certain about that.
Right. No, and that app makes absolute sense. I mean, I think more. I've had the fortune or of reading some of the best books in people's own voices and also interviewing authors, and I think that's the common thread all of them share, that
Yeah,
a core part of their process is staying true to your voice and not
yeah,
bowing into, like, I don't know, conformist pressure of,
yeah.
I don't know, trying to give it this literary shape, because this is something I've noticed, particularly in, like, say, the reading community, particularly like a
Mhm.
more privileged reading community, that there is a
Yeah,
certain way of judging writing, right? I mean, you
yeah,
would judge a certain form of writing,
yeah,
and I mean, say, I've been there. Like, I mean, say, like,
yeah,
a few, say, in my first year of college, I knew people, and in fact, I was one of those people who would say, I
yeah,
know, judge someone for reading a Chetan Bhagat or maybe a
yeah,
Durjoy Datta, like, simple structures,
yeah,
stories, focus. But just later on, you
mhm,
realize that it every author has their own voice, the kind of
yeah.
story that they're putting
And I
forward,
think,
and
yeah, and I think especially when I started studying literature and like I'm trained in literature. I'm not trained as a social, like I'm now trained as a social scientist, but when I was
right,
working on my books, that's what I knew: themes, forms, structures,
right,
how to break a novel down, how to read it, how to deconstruct it,
mm-hmm,
how to
mm-hmm,
put various lens, how to read it through various lens. And I think there's one thing, and as you study literature across ages, so
mm-hmm,
we did your 19th century literature, we did your
right,
Shakespeare's of the world, we did a lot of post independence, new age Indian novel. And I think you realize that there's this the highbrow literary world,
right,
or readers, not the literary world, but the highbrow literary readers who take a lot of pride in reading your classics,
mm-hmm,
come from a space of they come from a space where they've been told that this is good work,
right,
that this, because it's a classic, it's good, and
mm-hmm,
only this language, and work is only good if it mimics that language.
right,
But I think when you look around yourself, when you look at the most when you look at your contemporary novels, you realize the most unique thing about them,
mm-hmm,
something that makes it special, something that makes it being a modern day classic, a present
right,
day a present day literary phenomena, is that it has its own voice. And I think, and a
right,
great example of it would be Sally Rooney. She
right,
writes short sentences,
right,
simple
right,
sentences. It's a very simple story of
mm-hmm,
two teenagers. It's very much a young adult novel,
mm-hmm,
but it's such brilliant commentary. Another book that I read very similar is Exciting Times.
mm-hmm,
Simple sentences, brilliant commentary. And I think even literature has changed so much from what we read as kids to what we are reading right now.
right,
Um, that to believe that only a certain sort of form structure is considered good is a bit. I think it's a very shallow reading of, or very shallow. That's a very shallow standard of critiquing any work.
right.
Um, because it's very stagnant, and
No, I
literature isn't stagnant because it, literature isn't stagnant because it talks about the world, and world isn't
mhm,
stagnant. So
right.
if you're using frameworks that you use to read, um, that you use to critique work from, let's say, 19th century, that's
Mhm,
just that doesn't sit well. That doesn't make sense to me. So yeah,
right.
so I think I just wanted to do something true. I wanted to just write in like my own voice, like, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. And like, I'm so glad you put this across in that really poignant way that literature reflects the world around you, and the world can't be stagnant, right? And so literature can't be stagnant because and also I really admire the way you actually broke this entire argument down, because this is a problem, or actually not a problem as much as just a part of the discourse that's out there, that you will find people who really need to be told this, right? I think it reflects a lot on the kind of privilege that exists in this country, where a lot of people assume or are like just born into families where literature is not something that they explore, or it's just something that they inherit,
Mm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, you take up books that your parents read, or you're
Yeah.
guided into a more, say, a posher way of
Yeah.
life by
And
in
I
the kind
think
of
it's
schools you go to.
very No, I know exactly what you're saying, and I think
Hmm.
and it's often, and I think often that sort of reading and critique of literature is very classist and
Hmm. It
racist,
is. It
in
is.
a way, because you know because when you look at the look at the when you look at the literary industry, for the
Right.
longest time it had been dominated by white men,
Right.
right? So the only voice you hear from these classics are voices of rich white men.
Hmm. Right.
You don't hear a female voice, you don't hear a black woman's voice, and when it
Hmm.
comes to India, you only hear voices of upper caste privileged people who can afford to write, um who've been who can afford to write, who have been born into families where they have literary connections.
Right.
We're talking about early works, and
Hmm.
and it's only now that you see, it's only now when you're reading, um, you know when you're reading current day works,
Right.
how important it is to have diverse voices.
Right. And just to like pivot back to something that you mentioned earlier, right? I mean, the very fact that you appear to be political, and and I think that kind of, as much as you might not like it, it is a part of who you are as, I know, somewhat of an author now, because that is a voice that you hold, and it's a very important one at that. And that's when,
I love it. That's who I've always wanted to
right,
be. I think it's
right.
as much a part of me as anything else. I don't hate anything about it.
Okay, so Gurmeer,
But sorry, go on.
just to come back to something lighter,
Yeah.
what do you like to read? What we know, like the kind of stuff that you write, but what is it
Mhm.
that you love to read?
It really depends on my mood. I'm a very moody reader. But I love, it depends. It depends. I love reading theory sometimes.
Okay.
Most of the times. I think when I'm trying to make sense of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and what's happening in my own life, I
Right.
will read theory.
Okay.
So or I would read a lot of nonfiction. I would read a lot of essays, especially when I want to make sense of the world and make sense of what's happening, and sort of find ways to articulate feelings, emotions, what I see. And I think
Mm-hmm.
when I do want something, na- and I think when I'm in a mood for just being entertained, I read a
Right.
lot of literary fiction. I read a lot of young people.
Okay.
I love reading young people. I love
Right.
reading young female writers.
Right.
Um, so yeah, and
Okay.
lots of love
Okay.
stories, lots of romance. I don't though the only thing is I think I've outgrown romance novels a lot.
Okay. Okay.
Um, only because when you've read enough, when like I said, I love reading theory. When you've read enough
Mm-hmm.
feminist theory, you can't quite enjoy a romance novel because they're so
That's
because just the structure of it,
right.
it becomes very problematic. You start critiquing it. But I
Right.
think they're often but then of course there are wonderful new books that are coming.
Right.
which deal with this this sort of conundrum of young independent feminist women falling in love,
Hmm.
and how do they navigate it. So I think those are the sort of books I really really enjoy reading just for myself.
Okay, so Gurmehar, you have actually given me a very interesting one question to ask you, because it's
Mhm.
something I constantly grapple with, right? Uh, I when I went to law school, I was exposed to a lot of that, like that. To be completely honest, that's where I came in contact with feminist theory, or
Yeah,
the entire. I mean, the ability to study, say, something discrimination or racism and things like that.
yeah,
And the other side being that I've always been a huge Bollywood fan, and that's something
yeah,
I had to grapple with big time in college, because a lot of the things that I read, may which appealed to me, somehow just
yeah,
did not fit in with what what I termed as like my comfort movies or my comfort
yeah,
books, because as you pointed out, like a lot of them are just structurally problematic, right? I mean,
yeah,
you can't really. I mean, it becomes a very difficult stance to take when you say that you're a feminist and also like DDLJ, right?
yeah, yeah,
And it just, and the unfortunate truth is that, well, I mean, I still have to take that stance. So I mean,
yeah.
I'm assuming that that is something that you have to grapple with as well. So is there like a rational explanation that you kind of, what's the
Give to
story you sell to
people,
yourself? Actually, not people, to yourself. I really don't.
to
I mean,
myself.
that's, yeah. I mean, you can always come up with like excuses and reasoning that you can always elaborate to
Yeah,
people, but at
I
the end of
think
it, it
I
just
think
matters what you tell yourself.
I think when I read books or watch movies,
Mm-hmm.
or any form of storytelling, or books, movies, TV
Mm-hmm.
shows, I think I'm often not quite drawn to the story at large, but I'm often drawn to
Right.
characters,
Right.
and their personal lives and struggles.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think, and especially in that moment.
Right.
So if you tell me what do I like about EDLJ, I think
Mm-hmm.
I quite like this character of a young Punjabi girl,
Mm-hmm.
taking permission from her parents, going to Europe
Mm-hmm.
and falling in love with a boy,
Right.
and I like that journey.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the whole movie and what it eventually sells um,
Mm-hmm.
is is problematic. That why does
Mm-hmm.
one have to take permission from their father?
Mm-hmm.
Why does this man is stalking her this whole time? And of course,
Right.
those are arguments that still hold. But I think as a story, I'm very drawn to character and people's lives, and I think
Right.
and I think and I think and I think if when life is not devoid of um, these structures,
Mm-hmm.
um, to expect your storytelling be devoid of them is a bit. Um, then what is storytelling? Like then what story does one tell? Do you just tell stories
Right.
from utopian world,
Right.
right? So I can always say that I don't like or agree with the message that this movie um, at the end ends up giving, that hello, this is what love looks like. But I
Right.
do but I'm often very intrigued by journeys of characters and people, and how they
Right.
navigate life. And yeah, that's how I explain it to myself.
So, I mean, that's something I've, again, because I keep having this
Mhm.
argument in my head with myself. So, one of the biggest issues with that kind of arguments that I've often come up with is that, like, the idea that, well, that these are the kind of structures that exist, and hence storytelling of any art form, right, whether it's a movie or a
Yeah,
theater performance or like a book, would reflect this kind of these structures, which is true to a large extent. But then that also becomes a huge problem, because these are, at the end of it, art is consumed by society, and one might argue that these are the, by ensuring that these structures are also reflected in your art form, you are ensuring that these structures just don't go away, right? Like, I think this largely came up when, I think, in 2013 or 14, there was this movie Ranjana. I'm
yeah.
not too sure, right? Oh, so you heard. Great. So I mean, that was a classic
No,
argument of
hundred
this, right?
percent, 100%, hundred
Right.
percent. I think that's so true.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here's the thing. There's
Mm-hmm.
one thing for a movie to, it's one thing to tell a story of a society, and you often,
Right.
you see that, well, let's say this latest movie that just came out called Sir.
Mm-hmm.
What it does is where it just depicts where it just depicts an everyday, where it, where it shows you these structures existing, right, but doesn't sell
Right.
it as good to you. Whereas
Right.
in
Right.
CDLJ it sells you that, oh, this is
Right.
romance, and this is
Right. Right.
what's at, this is what's this is what, your life should, this is ideal, and this is what your life should look like.
Right.
um and I think that definitely needs to be called out. But I
Right.
often also think that when I go back and see the moment in time in which, well, this movie was situated,
Mm-hmm.
um, when we think about, because it's a romantic movie, so let's talk about love and the politics of love in India. I think
Right.
the moment in time that this movie was situated, um, your everyday, the biggest that the fact that these people
Mm-hmm.
are, or like this woman has a choice and is exercising that choice to marry the man she loves,
Mm-hmm.
can be seen as emancipatory, right? Or it
Right.
can be, maybe for young women, in maybe young women watching it back in the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
um, in their in who you know who have been told for a very long time that, you're going to, when you grow up, your father's going to find a boy for you, and you're
Right.
eventually going to marry them, and that's your normal, right? So when you see a young woman traveling on
Mm-hmm.
their own and finding a boy, and then finally, having this massive fight, because to even fight your parents, or to
Mm-hmm.
even take steps into wanting to achieve that sort of,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to achieve that relationship is, it takes, it takes a sort of, it takes courage,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I think maybe some girl watching it could be like, you know what, maybe I could do it too. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
if I see this young woman uh,
Right.
having the courage um, to take steps to eventually want to marry the man that she loves, then maybe I can do it too. And of course, now when
Right.
we look back, and we're just like, no, problematic. But I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe back in the 90s when it was situated, it was something that maybe emancipated women. It could be. I'm not saying it did. I'm just saying
Right. Right.
when you face it. And even something like, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum is such a problematic movie,
Mm-hmm.
right? So deeply problematic.
Right.
But uh, but but it's also quite interesting when you see a young it's also quite interesting, when you see a young Kareena Kapoor from a
Right.
timid, middle class Delhi family to go
Right.
to the UK and just like find herself as this
Right.
bold, and of course, these are still tropes. These are still very
Right.
problematic tropes that they're operating within.
Right.
But I do think it's quite entertaining, and there's always some upward movement there somewhere. Who
Right.
knows?
And yeah, and you know what?
Yeah,
So it actually just reminds me of this really interesting article I read a while back about. Uh, so the article took a look at how Dharma production movies that's essentially produced by Karan Johar dip-
yeah,
have matured with the depiction of homosexuality, how it went from and the idea presented there was that, well, or maybe what they're trying to do is just like normalize the situation by going from, say, like how homosexuality was shown in, say, Dostana to how it was
yeah,
shown in, say, Kapoor and Sons, about
yeah,
from going from like using it as like as for humor to making it
yeah,
a serious issue which you can talk about without
yeah,
mentioning the word at first, and then maybe like where we are today where we have like romantic movies about homosexuals, however they might
yeah,
fit that trope.
yeah,
So I mean, yeah, that's a context is always a brilliant like
yeah.
idea to have, right? But
I
coming
feel
back to
I feel like, yeah, if we talk about how we like, let's say, DDLJ,
Mhm.
We can always use that argument. But
Right.
right now, if somebody was to say, "Oh, I like a Kabir Singh," then you're just like, "No." But
Okay.
the
Right.
conversation has evolved. The world has evolved.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Oh,
right? You're meant to see why this is problematic.
right.
So I think there's always a difference of context for sure.
Right. So, anyway, just going back to your writing process. Uh, so, Gurmehar, how do you go about your process of writing? Because is it something that just comes to you organically or spontaneously, that you just have this idea and you just need to write it down, or is it something like something that you plan out? Like, how do you go about this?
I don't know if you've spoken to other writers, but I think the whole what I believe, I think the
Hmm.
whole idea that writing comes to writers organically, and just there are these little, winds and ideas in your brain, and all of a sudden there's this motivation where you're just, I'm going to take, tons of pages and
Right.
write away my whole life, and I'm going to do it with a glass of whiskey and 10 million cups of coffees through the night. I think that's such a goddamn lie. It's a lie that TV sells you. It's a lie that
Right.
even books that depict a writing life tells you. I genuinely think writing takes a lot
Yeah.
of discipline, and it takes a lot of work.
Right.
And it takes a lot of research. It takes reading. It takes planning. It takes organizing,
Right.
and a lot of and skills that you often associate with like daytime jobs, which
Right.
is scheduling. I mean, for me because I did two different books, but they both
Mhm.
I needed to schedule interviews for it, so it takes
Right.
scheduling, organizing,
Right.
breaking down, creating a structure, breaking down your characters, finding a life for them. I think the creative bit is only the meat of your writing process.
Right.
Um, but there's often a lot of logistics that are involved in it. So I think I does writing does writing come naturally to me? Maybe writing comes naturally to me, but I think the skill might come slightly easier to me.
Hmm.
Um, but I think the process, it's
Hmm.
very disciplined. It's
Right.
very it's The process is often you have to deal with the logistics, and then you eventually get onto writing.
It feels so good to like have an author like talk about this process, because truth be told, like I have spoken to a lot of writers about this, and a lot of them do like somewhat talk about this process, but not as with as much passion as you described it.
Yeah.
Because I know it's also about maybe a persona. Like a few authors do
Hmm.
want to put out that persona, that oh well, it's just this
Yeah.
beautiful poignant thing that happens, which is actually being sold on. But it's great to know, like I mean, I think, and for I know, like future authors out there who might be listening to this podcast, it's actually a really great lesson that, well, like you might love writing or you might be really good at it, but nothing can come without that disciplining and schedule and this
I
entire
mean,
process
yeah,
that goes into this.
100%. Because at the end of the day, what is writing? It's nothing unless you've put your ass down on your desk and like written
Hmm.
out the words,
Right. Right.
right?
Hmm.
And for me, that's just it. It's just like sit down, write
Hmm.
it, and don't wait
Hmm.
for a mood to strike, because mood will never
Right.
strike.
Exactly. Like
Um,
I mean
yeah,
those narratives that you're sold, that oh, inspiration must come to you, or like I mean, I do get writer's block is a thing,
yeah,
but sometimes you just have to like push past it, and like the only thing that helps is the process that comes with it. So
for sure.
Gurmeer, tell me like this one quirky thing that exists in your entire writing process, like oh, you just do XYZ while writing, or you can only write at night, things like that. Like are there any such things that, even despite being
Right.
part of the schedule, that fit into your this thing? Like I'll give you an example. In my previous episode, I was talking to Achal
Yeah,
Malhotra, the author of
yeah,
Separation, Remnants of a Separation, and she had a very quirky thing that she would only talk. There was a very fixed time between which she
yeah,
could write, which was at night, like from 10 to 3 in the night was when she could write.
yeah.
So I mean, something like that.
Do I have a quirky thing when it comes to writing? Let me think about it. I'm pretty sure I do. I'm so sure I do. It's just when you put me on a spot like this,
I'm
I'll have to
sorry.
do a bit of thinking.
Please
Um,
take your time. That's not a
yeah.
problem.
Um, it's a quirky thing I do. Hmm.
And that's the beautiful thing about quirky things, that I
Yeah.
think all of us do that with different things in life, but we just sometimes don't notice it.
Yeah,
And
you just don't
until
notice it,
you just
right? Yeah.
right, right.
Unless somebody like points it out to you. Um,
l-
I think one of the quirkier things that I do when I write,
mhm.
um, I don't know if it's quirky, but I think I perform it.
Okay, okay,
So
interesting.
whatever I'm writing, I will say it out loud.
Right,
Eventually, I would perform it to myself,
right,
and then if it fits, I think I go ahead with writing, which means I have to
right,
do it in a very private space.
right.
Um, yeah,
So
I
when you
think
say
that's one
perform,
quirky thing I always do.
so when you
I perform what I've written.
okay, so like it's like hand gestures and like voices and everything, or just like
It's
plain
voices.
reading out.
I mean, it's different with different books.
Okay,
With my first book, with my first book. Whenever there was dialogue, I would perform it.
okay,
Um, and just to see how it, just to see if the sentence is coming right,
right.
if the conversation is natural. Because often when
Mm-hmm,
you're writing it, and
mm-hmm.
then when you say it out loud, you're just, you realize that this is maybe not how people would speak.
Hanji.
So if I write my first thing, I speak it out, and if it
Right,
feels natural, let it go. If I don't, then I keep doing it till it sounds like a natural conversation when it comes to dialogue. With
right.
my second book, which was about young people and politicians, I think
Mm,
there were bits which were where I was reflecting, and
mm-hmm,
then there were bits where I was stating. So I think the bits
mm-hmm.
where I'm reflecting, I often perform it in a very I would often perform it in a reflective tone, like the way,
Right.
I would imagine like a camera on my face in a documentary, and I sit there and I'm reflecting on what I've understood of the world, and all the bits where I was stating or
Right.
concluding, I would perform it like a speech, as if I'm
Okay.
standing in front of 10 million people and I'm
Mhm.
saying, this is what I have to say.
Okay.
But yeah, that's how I think I perform what I write.
That's quite interesting because, like when you were saying all of this, the only thought
Mhm.
that crossed my mind was in your first book, where you write from the perspective of a child and who grows up, right? Uh, Firstly, it might have been. I'm assuming it would have been slightly difficult to kind of, I don't know, I don't know, enact or kind of assess whether that's how you. Because despite it being your own
Yeah,
thoughts and memories, it's just like difficult as say like a mid 20 or 20s
yeah,
person to kind of behave as a kid in your enactment,
yeah,
just for the purposes of like seeing, because the idea being that you wanted to see
yeah.
whether it comes out natural or
No,
not.
no, but I actually did it. I actually did it so
Right,
many times. I would because if you look at
right,
my first draft, there are often so many sentences which are a lot more longer.
right,
Um, which are a lot more longer than, especially dialogue sentences, which are a lot
right,
more longer, even because it's first person, so all of it is thinking. So
right.
I've had sentences, and then when I've read it out loud to them, and not maybe in a 3-year old's voice, but when I was reading
Mm,
it out, um, I was, it would strike me that a 3-year old would never say that. Like a
exactly.
3-year old
Right,
would never have the intellect to think this sentence, or would never
right,
have the intellect to reflect or reflect in the way that I've reflected here. So I think I would
right.
often find, and I think maybe this is actually how I ended up finding this quirky, or like building this quirky thing, because when I
Right,
was writing as a 3-year old, I had to sound like a 3-year old.
right.
Um, that I mean, no, I wouldn't talk in a baby voice, of course, but I would say it out loud. And every time where I was just like, nah, I can't imagine a kid
Right,
speaking or thinking like that, I would take that entire sentence out.
right. No, and that actually just brings me to the second thought that crossed my mind is, okay, given the fact that uh, a lot of the things that you write about are memories, and like raw core ones at that, like ones which are very emotional, deal with things that you genuinely experience. And so here's the thing, I'm assuming that uh, a lot of your conversations at home, especially in childhood, might not have been in English, right? Despite you,
Yeah,
like your entire family knowing it, it might have been in Punjabi, Hindi, or any other
yeah,
languages that your family speaks. So
yeah.
while encapsulating this in your book, right,
Mm.
did you ever struggle to kind of capture your emotions or the language that probably was used in that conversation back then? Like I remember the conversation, I think, from the time when you found out your nani or your dadi's passport,
Yeah, yeah,
passport from Pakistan, right? And I can imagine that to be a very heated conversation in like Hindi
yeah,
or like in Punjabi, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
I know. So do you think you did you struggle to kind of capture that level of anger or emotion in English, in which like a language in which the conversation did not happen and you were
Yeah,
just like
yeah.
penning it down, right?
I think it was very difficult to, especially particularly that chapter. It was very difficult to depict the sort of anger, because it's not anger that I really wanted to, that I really wanted to show.
Hmm.
But but I think but I think a reaction,
Mm-hmm.
um, born out of conditioning,
Right.
right? Anger is something that, you feel angry because you felt it, right? At
Mm-hmm.
3, I know that I'm meant to feel angry, even though I
Mm-hmm.
might not feel it in that moment.
Right.
At a Pakistani passport, because I've been conditioned to think it's bad and I'm meant to react in a certain way.
Right.
And I think one of those things for me was to capture the performance of that,
Mm-hmm.
because as a 3-year-old, you're only performing the anger meant you're told that you're meant to feel.
Right.
Um and, and I think the third difficult, like you said, how do you translate a conversation
Mm-hmm.
like that into English, which is a very, which is not the language, it which is not the best language for an emotion or a moment like that to be captured. I think one thing that I did very consciously was that I never switched, and I still do that. I never switched words like, um, let's say Babaji.
Hmm.
I would
Right.
never say God or Godman,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
Or or if it's never grandma in the book.
Exactly.
It's always
Exactly.
Dadi.
Something I noticed. Like
Yeah,
yes.
it's always Dadi Nani. It's always
Hmm.
Ma. It's always, so small things like that.
Right.
If I'm talking about, yeah, if I'm talking about, um, any of those things, I think the core essence, I never translate relationships, um, or or just how we speak about, let's say, religion or God,
Right.
or the way we talk about it in Hindi. And I think that might just help, with retaining, the essence of what happened in the English, and then retaining it in the English language. Yeah.
No, it definitely does. I mean, so very honestly, that was one of the
Mm.
first things that I heard about your book. That
Yeah.
it it somehow is captures emotions really well, right? And that's one of what my friends told me who read your book, and I can see why. Like, I mean, this was the first thing that leapt out at me when I was, reading your book. That
Yeah.
well, you were things like not switching
Mm.
nani and dadi for a common English like grandmother
Yeah.
thing, because after a point of time, language is also like there's a lot of socio-cultural context to a language, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like things like how like English just has uncle and no chacha, mama,
Yeah.
tau, tai, stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that becomes very important, especially while talking about
Mm.
emotions or memories and things that affect them.
Mm.
So something that I
Yeah.
really wanted to ask you was, okay, so uh, I am 25 and I graduated like 2 years ago. I was in law school for 5 years, and something which I realized, I know for a fact that you were at LSR and now you're at Oxford. Am I
Yeah.
wrong? Yeah. So
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
um,
Yeah.
right. So everything aside, you do have like your normal life, right? Like what every
Yeah.
student has to go through: assignments, friends, friend groups, all that ego fighting, blah blah, everything that happens in a person's college life, right?
Yeah.
And your crazy dating stories, of course. But so what I did notice was that, well, around 2016, 17, basically when when you participated, when that video of yours went viral, and subsequently you've been thrust into the spotlight, right? I mean, to
Yeah.
the extent that you are a public figure of sorts, where you do enjoy a good social media following, where people scrutinize things that you do
Yeah.
or things that you post about or things that you write
Yeah.
about, and and obviously your work, as great as it is, it has just propelled you into this, as you mentioned, right? Like you've
Yeah.
become, people assume you're very political and very sad all the time,
Yeah.
Okay.
Very sad and
So,
it's so fun. Yeah.
no, I mean you get what I mean. That
It's true, yeah,
it's
yeah, that's true.
is it like a, how do you handle that life? I mean, I get like being a student in itself comes with its own set of issues, and
Yeah.
this is just like this very weird scrutiny, like trolling from like people on the of the right wing on on your Twitter, for example,
I think it's not
shit
like
like that.
I think it's definitely not been easy, and I don't think I
Mm-hmm.
was prepared for it when I was, when it happened because I was in my first year of college.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, and I think I learned as I went on. How
Right.
do you? I did lose out. I did lose out on friendships a lot, college groups a lot because I didn't know how to manage life
Right.
anymore. How do you
Right.
manage because think about it, it's your first year in college. You
Mm-hmm.
anyway don't know how to manage
Mm-hmm.
relationships and friendships and people.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of it you have it's then there's this whole stress of managing work and life and people's perceptions that come with it. And I think I did struggle with it a lot
Mm-hmm.
back then, particularly in LSR.
Mm-hmm.
I learned as I went along, um,
Right.
as one does. So my college years weren't exactly. I think my LSR years were not very full of regular experiences in that
Okay.
sense. I mean, of course, I
Mm-hmm.
went to class. Of course, but for me, the 2 years after Amjad, I
Mm-hmm.
went to class. I came back home,
Mm-hmm.
slept, and I went to work, and then I worked and I worked and I worked. So I was either writing the books, I was either researching the books, I was either taking meetings, I was either doing public events.
Mm-hmm.
I did miss out on a lot of college. I think for
Right.
me, and I haven't, and which is why I say this. I promised myself when I graduated LSI and I was going to Oxford that
Mm-hmm.
for 1 year I'm not going to publish anything, and I'm not going
Okay.
to do public events,
Right.
and I'm not going to engage with politics maybe as much as I did back then. Of course, the
Right.
CA happened, but which was very organic. That's something
Mm.
one just had to be a part of it.
Right.
But I was very conscious of the fact that I wouldn't do it.
Mm.
I wouldn't do it while I was there. I'm going to take 1 year of this anonymity, this freedom of not being known, of being seen for who I am,
Right.
and experience life and relationships. And I think and I think it's been the greatest, most rewarding period of my life in that sense.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
No, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, just if you speak to any, particularly like women or like
yeah,
people from low caste who actually are politically opinionated. Like, I mean, I don't think I get to say this as a privileged man, but
yeah.
I do empathize with this situation wherein being political is very draining. It does
Yeah.
take efforts to be politically opinionated and speak out about things that bother you, things that and in fact, things that particularly might not be issues in your life, but you do recognize the wrongs around you and talking
I
about
think I I think the anger isn't difficult. To
them.
feel a certain way and to have an opinion is not difficult. I think that comes instinctively.
Right.
I think what's difficult is saying that and having to engage with what comes
Exactly.
after.
Right. Right.
So I think
Right.
that's just so the anger and opinion is not something I've ever struggled with. That's never difficult. I think it's the like that's me. That's who I am.
Right.
I think
Right.
what really what really does um what really does begin to bother and drains is having to one have that opinion and then to deal with just days and days of God knows what.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
get what you mean. Like that, and that's exactly what I was going to come to, right after that. That, well, like you mentioned CA, right? Like, and it was, I remember it being draining for me after a few days to, argue with people about why it's not, like, why it's such a bad law. Like, there were people who would be a, speak about, like, on my friend list or, like, whatever. who would be talking about how it actually makes sense and etc. And I would
Yeah.
try and engage and try and tell them. And after a few days, I did feel drained, right? Like, I mean, it does take it over. And given, so, and that's where your entire public persona also ties into it. I mean, I can imagine how bad it was for me. It would
Yeah.
have been so much worse for someone who's facing it from, say, unknown people, right? Like having to engage and like, so, I mean, yeah, that is something I sympathize with. And I'm glad you took that time off. I mean, that would have been very rewarding, as you mentioned it.
Yeah.
So,
100%.
Gurmehar, tell me this. Who, if I
Yeah.
ask you, I know it's a very difficult thing to do for a bibliophile, and I hate doing this to you, but I have to.
You're just going to
Uh,
ask me my favorite author or my favorite book. I'm already saying I
yes.
can't name.
No,
No.
no, I'm not going to ask you to do one. That I'm not going to be that cruel. I can't do it myself, so I won't be asking you to do that. But I would ask you to name like 5 books that you really, really can't live without. And just to make the
I
process
can't live
easier,
without.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So, and to make the process easier, I'll give you an example of my own, and probably
Yeah.
like I'll and just to be clear, it could be like, I don't know, it could be just something that you hold emotional value with, right? Like for me, my
Okay.
favorite book, despite everything that I've ever read, is like very
Yeah.
subjectively The Kite Runner, because
Yeah.
it was one of the first books my mother gifted me the copy when I was 10. Um,
Yeah.
so
No,
my
for
mother,
yeah, I feel you. I think a thousand splendid suns is definitely up there for me.
right,
Um,
yeah. So no, so
is
for me, it was so exactly what I meant, exactly what I mentioned subjectively, because I know like deep down, like very objectively, when I'm reading, I kind of know that I would place A Thousand Splendid Suns off as a better book, and it did affect me emotionally very differently. But it's just like I
yeah.
hold like a special emotional value for the Kite Runner because of other personal reasons.
Yeah.
So if
Um,
taking all
so
that
what
into
would
account,
be
you don't need
five
to go
books?
into the reasons, but like say 5 books, so
Okay.
maybe 3 books. I don't know, whatever
Okay.
works for you.
That are very special. So, I think the first would be Little Women. One of um, my librarian in this convent school that
Yes.
I used to study in gifted it to me. One of the
Okay.
copies from the book, from the
Right.
book rack, because kids under like before class 5 couldn't issue
Mm-hmm.
books.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like go every single day to the
Mm-hmm.
library in
Mm-hmm.
recess, which is anyway 30 minutes. So I would like shove food down my throat while running from like one end of the corridor to the other, and
Right.
spending 25 minutes in the library just to read like
Right.
5 or 10 pages of the book and then leave it
Right.
because we couldn't issue it. And then my
Right.
librarian saw it, and when I was leaving the school in grade 5, she gifted it to me, and I think that's
Oh.
one of the most special books. Like one of the
Right.
most like that I can't live without.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Second would be, oh my God, what is this question?
I understand how difficult this is. Trust me, I do.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I don't think I can live without my copy of Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that's what just pushed me to be a more political citizen.
Right.
That for me, I keep saying this. For me, activism comes through writing and literature,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because of Arundhati Roy. I
Right.
came to politics through reading her work,
Right.
and reading her, and living her stories.
Right.
So definitely that's a very special book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I quite like the book Thief,
Okay.
because it inspired. I think the book Thief and Anne Frank Diary would be very special books for me, because I really needed. These are books that capture children's lives
Right.
in the face of a conflict,
Right.
and I think these are books that quite inspired why I wanted Small Axe to be in a child's voice. So
Right.
yeah, I think these 4 books.
Right.
Do I have to give another? Do you have to give a
No,
fifth
it's fine.
one?
No, it's
It's
fine. Don't worry
fine.
about it. It's
I
completely
think
fine.
there is this one book that's
Yeah.
very special to me.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, two. One is called Small Acts of Freedom, and the other is called The Young and the Restless. I don't think I can ever live without them. But yeah,
Of course. Of course. Hey, do
my
you
two
do you
least.
happen to know the author though?
I've heard about
I,
her, but I've heard
uh,
she's quite a character. I'm not sure if I'm a
yeah,
fan of her.
yeah.
Her
I
work
was
is
just yeah, I was listening to this podcast, dude. Like, she sounds very political and sad,
yeah,
and just like
yeah,
does this these odd things about like act reading out her work to herself, which is
yeah,
weird too.
yeah. She's a bit of a
But
strange character, but her
yeah,
books are great, so everyone
yeah,
must read it.
that I can't stress enough on. They are actually really great. I'm not even kidding you. But yeah,
Thank you.
like I'm glad you mentioned Arundhati Roy, because I remember reading God of Small Things for the first time, and so uh, by the time I was reading it, I think I read it in my second or third year of college. So I was about 19 or 20, I think, when I read it, and I remember reading it and feeling at first, I think about for the first 150 pages, I felt very underwhelmed to the extent that I felt, okay, this is just well written stuff, but I wasn't really feeling anything about the book or anything come up apart from like these moments here and there. And then I
Yeah,
don't know, all of a sudden, I'm pretty sure you remember the theater scene, right? Like where they go and suddenly the book overwhelmingly hit me. It's just like
yeah,
I and that's the beauty of her writing. I mean, I'm a huge fan
yeah.
of her work, and yeah, like I think I would place it on my top five list as well. So yeah, Gurmehar, now that your dinner's here, I think I'll wrap this up. Just one last question before we go. Um, so are you planning? What's in the future? Like, are you currently working, or are you like do you still have studying left? Do you plan on like writing more in the future? Is there anything immediately coming up?
I do plan to write more, and I do
Mm-hmm.
want to study more for sure.
Right.
So those two things are very, very standard. But
Mm-hmm.
I think right now I'm definitely giving myself some time, uh,
Right.
because for the last 3 years, like I said, my college years,
Mm-hmm.
I went from one thing to the other, and then
Right.
while I was doing my masters, even though I wasn't right, even though I wasn't writing, it was
Mm-hmm.
still a very draining degree. A
Of
master's
course.
is very expensive.
Yeah.
I do want to take some time and just see where it goes. So I think I definitely want to write more. I definitely want to study more.
Mm-hmm.
Because LSR was difficult. I just kept on working and I kept on working and I kept on
Right.
working. Internships, writing books, events, marketing the books,
Mm-hmm.
book tours, and then summer schools,
Right.
applying to colleges. All of these
Right.
things were, these were very, and of course, your regular exams in college and tests and assignments,
Right.
and participating in societies. Uh, so all of that was quite overwhelming.
Right.
And then the master's degree, even though I wasn't working the way I
Mm-hmm.
would, it was still very, very draining.
Right.
So right now I am taking a little time to myself, and and yeah, I'll see where life takes me. I don't have any concrete plans.
Okay. That well, Gurmeer, I really hope that you do write some more stuff because I genuinely enjoyed reading your first book. I'll make sure I get to your second book soon, but I really hope that you write more. And thank you so much for doing this with us. This was a really
Yeah,
fun
thanks
conversation.
so much for having me. I'm so sorry for annoying you so much by changing the dates. Thank you.
That's okay. That's not an issue. Don't worry about it.
Thank
Thank
I had
thank
so
you.
much fun speaking to you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. To check out the rest of our podcast or work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe to our podcast. You can follow us on Instagram at Kitabi Karwan. We do a lot of other stuff as well. We post about books. We talk to authors on Instagram Lives. We discuss books on different platforms. So yeah, I think you might like it. Also, we do giveaways and sometimes we organize fun contests to question and answers, polls. So please reach out to us with different feedback or if you want to see us do something different, and we'll get back to you. Thank you for listening.